Nobody had touched him in 3 years. Not a hand on the shoulder, not a hug goodbye, not even an accidental brush of fingers passing a coffee cup. And then a 3-year-old girl in a mismatched sock and a grape juice-stained shirt looked up at him and asked if she could fix that. "My name's not important yet. You'll get there. What matters is the man on the bench, and the little girl who walked straight through 36 years of armor like it was nothing at all." Marcus Whitfield built Whitfield Dynamics out of a 2-bedroom apartment and a maxed-out credit card when he was 24. By 36, his name sat on the cover of business magazines next to words like visionary and relentless. He owned 4 cars he never drove and a house on the bluffs outside Chicago with 11 bedrooms, only 2 of which had ever been slept in. When he walked down the east hallway at night, his own footsteps came back to him off the marble like an argument he couldn't win. 3 years earlier, he'd had a wife, Renee, and a daughter on the way, due in 2 weeks, already named Josephine after Renee's grandmother. A driver ran a red light on a Tuesday night in the rain and took both of them from him in the same 90 seconds. Marcus didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about much of anything anymore. He worked 19-hour days because the alternative was sitting still, and sitting still meant remembering the sound Renee's laugh used to make in that kitchen. The one that stood empty now, except for a coffee machine and a housekeeper's radio playing low in the mornings. That housekeeper was Marisol Vega, 30 years old, sharp-eyed, quiet in the way people get when they've learned that quiet keeps a job. She'd been cleaning the Whitfield house for 7 months, and in that time Marcus had said maybe 40 words to her total. Not out of cruelty, the man barely registered his own reflection some mornings, let alone the woman dusting his bookshelves. Marisol didn't take it personally. She had bigger problems. Her mother had died in the spring, and with her went the only childcare Marisol could actually afford. Daycare ran nearly what she made in 2 weeks, and rent didn't wait for grief. So she'd started doing something that made her stomach twist every single day. Bringing her daughter, June, 3 years old, gap-toothed, endlessly curious, to work. And tucking her into the mudroom off the kitchen with a coloring book, a juice box, and a whispered promise to be quiet as a mouse. For 6 weeks it worked. Marcus lived behind a closed office door, and June was a very good mouse. Then came a Thursday that started like every other one and ended up rewriting both their lives. Marcus had taken a call out on the back terrace, one of those calls that drains something out of you and gives nothing back. 3 lawyers and a board member arguing about numbers that used to matter to him and now just sounded like static. When it finally ended, he sank onto the stone bench that faced the garden and stared at nothing, tie loose, shoulders folded in. His eyes were dry, but there's a particular kind of dry that comes after you've already cried everything you had in private years ago, and there's simply nothing left to leak out anymore. He didn't hear the footsteps. June had slipped out of the mudroom while her mother ran the vacuum upstairs, drawn outside the way kids are drawn to anything with a door left cracked open. She wandered across the patio in a purple dress 2 sizes too big, a plastic butterfly clip barely holding back a mop of curls, and stopped directly in front of the stranger on the bench. Studying him with the total lack of self-consciousness only a 3-year-old can manage. "You look sad," she said, not a question yet, just an observation, flat and true. Marcus blinked down at her, caught completely off guard. Then she asked the question that would end up on the other side of everything. "Can I hug you?" He opened his mouth to say the automatic thing, "I'm fine, sweetheart." Nothing to worry about. The same line he'd fed every well-meaning employee and reporter, and second cousin for 3 years running. But June just stood there with her arms half raised, patient, waiting, like she already knew his mouth and his chest were saying 2 completely different things. And something in him gave out. He thought of Renee. He thought of Josephine, who would have been 3 now, the exact same age as the small, stubborn girl standing in front of him, refusing to leave. He thought about every night he'd spent in that enormous house, surrounded by more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes, and starving, absolutely starving, for something as simple as a hand on his arm. He didn't sob, he didn't make a sound at all, really. He just sat there, a man whose signature could move a stock price, with tears running down into his collar while a toddler closed the last 2 feet of distance and wrapped her arms around his neck. As far as they'd reach. patting his back the exact way he'd learn later. Her mother patted hers after a nightmare. "It's okay," June whispered against his shoulder. "Mama says hugs make sad go away." Marcus closed his eyes and for the first time in 3 years let himself hold on to somebody. He had no idea yet how far that one small hug was about to travel. Marisol found them like that. She'd come downstairs already sick with worry, calling June's name under her breath, and rounded the corner into the garden to find her daughter wrapped around the neck of Marcus Whitfield, CEO. Billionaire, the coldest name on staff's group chat, both of them crying on a stone bench like the world had ended and started over in the same minute. June, Marisol was already moving, scooping her daughter up before she'd even finished the thought. "Mr. Whitfield, I am so sorry. I don't know how she's not supposed to be out here. She's not supposed to bother. She's not bothering me." Marcus wiped his face fast, almost angry at himself for how unwilling he suddenly was to let the moment go. She's something else, actually." Marisol's stomach dropped anyway. Her brain was already 3 steps ahead, doing the math it always did in situations like this. Would he fire her? Would he call the agency? Would this be the thing that finally tipped her, and June out of the only stability they had left? Women in her position didn't usually get a second read of the room. They got one mistake and a door closing behind them. "Please," she said, voice shaking, June balanced on her hip now. "I should have asked. I didn't have anyone to watch her this summer, and daycare was I couldn't. She stays quiet, I promise. She doesn't touch anything. Marisol." His voice cut through hers, gentle but firm. "Stop, you don't owe me an explanation." She looked up at him, still braced for the other shoe. "I didn't know you were dealing with any of this," he said. "Why didn't you say something?" Marisol let out a breath that shook on the way down. "Because people like me don't usually get to ask people like you for favors, Mr. Whitfield. I needed this job too much to risk it." The sentence landed harder than she meant it to, and Marcus felt something hot and uncomfortable climb up the back of his neck, shame mostly. He thought about how he moved through his own house like a ghost most days, barely registering the people who kept the whole machine running. He hadn't known Marisol had a daughter. He hadn't asked. Not out of malice, grief had simply made him blind to everything but his own weight. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have known that about you. I should have asked if you needed anything." "That's on me." Marisol blinked, clearly not prepared for an apology from the man who signed her paycheck. June, meanwhile, had recovered fully and was now poking curiously at the sleeve of his tailored shirt. "Are you not sad anymore?" she asked, blunt as ever. Marcus let out a laugh, surprised, a little wet around the edges, the first real one anyone in that house had heard out of him in years. "A little less sad." "Thanks to you." Marisol watched the whole exchange like she was witnessing something that shouldn't have been physically possible. 7 months in this house, and she had never once seen this man's face do that. "Can she stay?" Marisol asked carefully. "Just until I find something better." "I'll keep her out of your way." Marcus looked down at June, who had already moved on to attempting, with great seriousness, to braid a section of his hair. "She can stay," he said. "In fact, I insist." That night, after June was asleep in their small 2-bedroom apartment across town, Marisol sat at her kitchen table and cried, not from fear this time, but from the strange, cautious relief of someone who'd spent weeks bracing for disaster and gotten kindness instead. She didn't know that, in the same hour, Marcus Whitfield was standing in a nursery 3 miles away that he'd built and never used, running a hand along the rail of an empty crib. Feeling something in his chest he hadn't felt since before the accident. Hope, uninvited and completely unfamiliar. Not everyone in his life was going to be glad to see it show up. Over the next few weeks, the house on the bluffs started sounding like a different building entirely. Marcus began coming home before dark. He started eating at the kitchen table instead of alone behind a closed door, plate balanced on top of a spreadsheet. He learned June's favorite cartoon, her favorite snack, exactly how she needed her stuffed rabbit tucked under her left arm for nap time, and not the right. Marisol watched it happen almost in disbelief. The coldest, most unreachable man she'd ever worked for slowly turning into someone who left his office door open, who laughed at things, who scooped June up the second he walked in because she'd started shouting, "Mr. Mars," her own invented nickname for him, the moment his car hit the driveway. The staff noticed too. The chef mentioned, half joking, that chicken nuggets had made it onto the grocery order for the first time in the house's history. The driver mentioned, with a raised eyebrow, that there was now a car seat installed in the back of the Mercedes. Small things. But to anyone who remembered the old Marcus, they were nothing short of a miracle. Not everyone found the miracle charming. His younger sister, Bree Whitfield, chief operating officer, sharp as broken glass, and used to running half the company by default while her brother stayed locked in his grief, arrived one afternoon expecting a meeting about a merger, and instead found Marcus sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, building a block tower with a toddler while a housekeeper folded laundry nearby and hummed along to the radio. "What," Bree said slowly, setting her briefcase down like it had suddenly gotten heavier, "is going on here?" "Bree," Marcus didn't look up. "This is June and her mother, Marisol. I can see that." Bree's voice had gone tight, controlled. "What I don't understand is why the CEO of a 9-figure company is stacking blocks instead of reviewing the merger documents I sent you 3 days ago. I'll get to them." He added another block. June clapped like it was the greatest architectural achievement in human history. Bree excused herself to the kitchen. A few minutes later, Marcus found her by the window, arms crossed, staring out at the garden. "You've changed," she said without turning around. "I have." "Is that a problem for you?" Marcus asked. "You've been missing calls, delaying decisions, the board's starting to talk." She finally turned. "And now I come here and find you playing house with the cleaner's kid." Something flashed hot behind Marcus's ribs, but he kept his voice level. "Her name is Sophia's sorry. June's mother is Marisol, and she's done more for me in a month than 3 years of grief counseling." Bree studied him, something colder now behind the worry. "I'm concerned about the company, and frankly, I'm concerned about people taking advantage of you. You're vulnerable right now, Marcus. Grieving people make impulsive decisions." "What do you actually know about this woman?" "I know she's never once asked me for anything," Marcus said. "Not money, not favors. If anything, I've had to talk her into letting me help." "Just be careful," Bree said finally, gathering herself. "A lonely, grieving billionaire looks like an opportunity to a lot of people, whether they mean it that way or not." The words stuck in him longer than he wanted them to. That night, watching Marisol carry a sleeping June to the car, still thanking him for a kindness she seemed to genuinely struggle to believe was real and not a trap. He found himself wondering, was Bree right to worry? Or did she just no longer remember what it felt like to have something crack a sealed heart back open? He wasn't going to get much time to sit with the question. 2 days later, quietly and without telling him, Bree started digging into Marisol's background, her finances, her past, anything that might prove her right. What she found was about to blow the whole fragile good thing wide open. The following week, Marisol got a call asking her to come to Marcus's office, a room she had cleaned exactly 9 times and never once been invited into as anything other than staff. Her stomach was in knots the entire walk over. June's hand gripped tight in hers because there'd been no time that morning to find someone to watch her. Bree was already seated in the corner, arms folded, face arranged into something carefully neutral that put Marisol on edge before anyone had said a word. "Marisol," Marcus's voice had a strain in it she'd never heard from him before. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." "Of course," her heart was hammering. Bree slid a folder across the desk. "We ran a standard background check. Anyone with this much access to the house goes through one eventually." Her tone stayed clinical. "Your mother left behind unpaid medical debt. You've missed rent twice this year. And 3 months ago, right around the time you started bringing your daughter into a billionaire's house, you took out a life insurance policy on yourself." Marisol went white. "It's not what it looks like," she said. "Then what is it?" Bree leaned forward. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a woman under financial pressure found an opening and used her kid to work her way into a grieving man's sympathy." "Bree!" There was a warning in Marcus's voice now, but underneath it, a flicker of doubt Marisol caught immediately, and it hurt worse than the accusation itself. "The policy is for June," Marisol said, voice shaking but not breaking. "In case anything ever happens to me so she's not left with nothing. I took unpaid leave to care for my mother before she passed, which is why the rent slipped." I have never once asked you for $1, Mr. Whitfield. I didn't even want her here in the first place. I was terrified you'd let me go over it. June tugged at her mother's sleeve, sensing the temperature in the room. Mama, why's everybody talking loud? Nobody answered right away. Marcus looked between his sister's certainty and Marisol's trembling honesty. And something in him, the same something June had cracked open weeks earlier on that bench, refused to let the worst version win. Bree, he said slowly, leave us. Marcus, please. She gathered her folder and left, shooting Marisol a look on the way out that made it very clear this wasn't finished. Once the door clicked shut, Marcus knelt down to June's eye level. Hey, kiddo, want to go pick out a book from that shelf? Anyone you like? June nodded and wandered off, delighted by the assignment. Marcus turned back to Marisol, his face softening. I'm sorry, he said. That should never have happened the way it did. Marisol wiped angrily at her own eyes, furious at herself for crying in front of him. If you want to let me go, I understand how this looks. I don't want to let you go. His voice was firm now. I believe you. I should have believed you the second she opened that folder, and I'm ashamed it took me even a second of doubt. Then why did it? The hurt in her voice was plain. Marcus dragged a hand through his hair. Because I've been burned before by people who wanted my money more than they wanted anything real, but that's my wound. Not something you did. He glanced toward June, now sprawled on the floor, flipping through a picture book with total concentration. She gave me my life back. The least I can do is trust her mother with it. Something in Marisol's chest finally loosened. But she also knew with a heavy kind of certainty that Bree wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. It all came to a head a week later, over a dinner that Bree had clearly walked into with a script prepared. If you keep this up, she warned, setting down her fork, the board is going to start questioning your judgment. They'll say grief clouded your decisions. Someone might push for a leadership review. Marcus set his own fork down, calm in a way he hadn't managed in years. Let them, Bree blinked. I built this company from a 2-bedroom apartment, he went on. I've given it everything for over a decade, including years I should have spent actually grieving my wife and daughter instead of hiding behind quarterly reports. If the board wants to challenge me because I finally found something worth smiling about, they can bring it to a formal vote. I won't apologize for choosing to be happy again, Bree. Not anymore. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Something in his eyes stopped her, a clarity she hadn't seen since before the accident, and a steadiness fear tactics clearly weren't going to touch this time. This isn't about the company, Marcus said, gentler now. This is about you being scared of what happens if I actually come back to life. Bree's eyes welled up before she could stop them. I didn't want to watch you fall apart a second time, she admitted quietly. Not after Renee, I couldn't do it again. I know. He reached across and squeezed her hand. But disappearing into work wasn't protecting me. It was just a slower way of vanishing. June reminded me what it actually feels like to be alive. Over the following months, the walls between the two families came down one brick at a time. Bree, once she let go of the fear driving all of it, grew genuinely attached to June, showing up unannounced just to see the little girl who had somehow managed to humanize her impossible brother. Marisol's financial worries eased when Marcus quietly arranged for her mother's remaining medical debt to be paid off. Not charity. He insisted every time she tried to argue. Just one family looking out for another. 6 months after that first hug on the garden bench, Marcus asked Marisol to dinner. Not employer to employee this time. Two people who'd found something unplanned and real in the wreckage of their own separate griefs. Marisol, cautious but hopeful, said yes. A year after the hug that started it all, on a quiet afternoon in that same garden, Marcus knelt down in front of June, 4 years old now, missing a different tooth. Still fearless, and asked her the most important question he'd asked anyone in a long time. June, would it be all right with you if I married your mom? That would make me your dad. Officially, I mean. June considered this with exactly the seriousness she'd once brought to a stranger's tears on a stone bench, then threw both arms around his neck. You're already my dad, she said simply. This just makes it true on paper, too. Marcus laughed and cried at the same time, and for once in his life, the tears didn't feel like grief at all. They felt like the opposite. The house on the bluffs, the one that used to send his own footsteps back at him like an accusation, filled up finally with something else, small feet running down hallways. Laughter that didn't sound careful. The ordinary chaos of a family that actually lived there instead of just existing inside its walls. Marcus Whitfield, the man who'd once had every single thing money could buy, and none of the things that actually mattered, had learned the hard way that the most valuable thing he'd ever been handed didn't come with a price tag at all. It came from a 3-year-old with a plastic butterfly clip in her hair, standing in front of a stranger on a bench, asking one simple, fearless question. "You look sad, sir. Can I hug you?" Sometimes the smallest people carry the biggest kind of medicine. I think about that a lot, honestly, how it wasn't a boardroom or a therapist or a decade of money that finally got through to him. It was one kid who hadn't learned, yet that grown-ups are supposed to keep their sadness to themselves. If you were sitting on that bench, if a stranger's kid walked up and asked to hug you on your worst day, what would you have done? Let me know down in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. If this one got you in the chest a little, do me a favor and hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you in the next one.